Hello everyone and welcome to Climate Australia. I am your host Lee Constable and today we're talking about decolonisation, climate and Australia. Whatever Australia means. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm broadcasting to you from. I'm here in Redcliffe, which is otherwise known as Turrbal and Yugara land, and also there are Gubbi Gubbi people to the north. This is land where it's actually been really interesting, having moved here recently, to find out more about where I am, what that means to me as a visitor, as a white person on this land, and what it might mean to me as a white person starting a channel called Climate Australia. So I'm on this journey to try and figure out not only what it means for me as an individual, but as someone who's got a platform. In doing so, I am reaching out to people in all sectors. So I'm talking to policymakers, decision makers in lots of different areas. And I wanted to invite my guest today, Djarra Delaney, because I found it really interesting to think about what it means to be talking about climate change and Australia in the context of decolonisation. So I'd like to introduce you to Djarra Delaney, and I'll bring him up on screen now. Djarra, would you like to tell us where you are today?
Yeah, so I also want to acknowledge the country where I live and work. That's the Wurundjeri people. They're custodians of Melbourne and the surrounding areas there. And pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. The reason we pay respects to the country is to remind ourselves that this land was never ceded by Indigenous peoples, and that's a really important thing to bear in mind when we're kind of living and working around Australia, that all country is owned and kind of is not necessarily owned, but taken care of by Indigenous peoples from different community groups.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And so you yourself are a Quandamooka man, and for those who don't know, that's not far from where I am right here.
No, yeah. So I'm a Quandamooka man. I come from the Quandamooka peoples, which is made up of three different tribes, the Ngunnawal, Gurrumpul and Nulli peoples of the Moreton Bay region. So that goes from North Stradbroke Island, Moreton Island, islands around it, Redland Shire, and the Sea Country as well, that ties all of that together. And it's a very interesting environment. Sand islands, the sand moves a lot and is impacted by tides and weather and climate, as that becomes more of an issue in dealing with caring for country. And that's why I'm exploring these issues of climate change and decolonisation, particularly. Our people have a long history of adapting and responding to climatic changes. It wasn't always Moreton Bay. It was before the large 100-metre sea level rise that isolated Tasmania and Australia from Papua New Guinea. We lived in the Bay region as land, and archaeological evidence in our region goes back 22,000 years, so prior to that event. And so we've got stories about our people living on what is now Moreton Bay, but wasn't a bay at the time. And so there's a long history in Australia of climate change and adapting to climate change, but I think it's important, particularly in our talk today, is to think about this current climate change as a kind of colonial climate change, which we can get to a bit later.
Yeah, and I think I always start episodes and people start events more and more in Australia with this acknowledgement of country. If you're not someone who is a traditional custodian of the land you are on, but I think often, it is something you say at the start, and sometimes it can end right there as far as acknowledging country and thinking about what that means. So I think this acknowledgement of country at the top of this is one where I wanted to take some more time to think about, where I am making this. And given that you know more about the land that I'm on than I do, it's really great to have you here and be able to talk to you about your area of expertise and how that applies to what you're doing now. So I'd love for you to talk about, we will get to your PhD that you started this year, but could you give a bit of a background for everyone on your kind of journey, because you've gone on a bit of a career journey into working with community, working with remote, rural, coastal communities, working on climate justice and community-driven solutions to climate, and what that actually means and how that can actually be a more effective way than the, white Western approach to climate solutions. How did you end up on this path? What's your story?
Yeah, interesting. That's a very generous overview, but of my work. But I do think it's, in a lot of ways, growing up I grew up in Brisbane and Stradbroke Island, and the environment is so important to me as part of my cultural kind of connection back to Stradbroke, even when I'm down in Melbourne or, living in Brisbane, going to school, having that place as country to go back to and go swimming or fishing or just enjoying that environment as our traditional connection to that environment is so important. So I was always really, really interested in the environment from both a kind of scientific perspective, although my career isn't developed into a scientific career over time, but particularly around our feelings and our kind of philosophy and our attitude towards the environment is really important to me. So I started as a undergraduate looking at philosophy generally, looking at philosophy and literature, and that's a very white, male-dominated space still at the moment. And there were some opportunities to engage with environmental philosophies or deep ecology or those things that really question and ask questions about our relationship to the environment. But I did feel like there was a missing respect. There wasn't that respect paid in Australia to actually having a look at how Indigenous peoples know and live with the environment in Australia, but this also applies worldwide too. So when I left university, I really wanted to work in that space and think a bit more about Indigenous ways of knowing or knowledges. And so I joined the Bureau as a graduate at the Bureau of Meteorology and worked my way into managing seasonal weather calendars, which are a project there that looks at, Indigenous ways of knowing the environment. So the interconnection between seasons and weather and the environment and seasonal indicators like the changing of plants and animals and the different availabilities of food and the different cultural traditions that are associated with certain periods of time, and how that links with the changing of the seasons through generations of learning to create what is often, it's not always presented as a kind of wheel, but and I think that's probably when people think about a traditional seasonal calendar, I think the wheel showing the kind of seasonal changes throughout is probably the most typical presentation. But it's very much not about dates or times. It's very much about the changing environmental indicators, and it's a very different way of looking at the environment. So there's work being done all over the country on recording and generating and having that seasonal environmental knowledge there for the community to pass down to younger generations in lots of different formats. And the Bureau of Meteorology has the website, Indigenous Weather Knowledge, which can be accessed through the homepage, as a kind of hosting site for some communities if they want to use that, have that available. So that was a big part of my wanting to engage more with the community and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of thinking about the seasons and the environment. And then that led into a Master's of Environment and now into a PhD, kind of taking those that idea further and further to look at, well, why is it not? Why aren't we looking at that more?
Yeah.
Why isn't that a story that is talked about in the Australian national consciousness? Why is that not really a feature of our way of being and living in Australia?
Yeah, no, it makes sense if you think about the fact that it's been 250, 200 years, depending on where you are across the many nations that make up Australia, as far as colonisation and the impacts on traditional custodians. And also the Western way of record keeping and of taking stock of what's happening with seasons, weather, climate, all those things. That's not when our records really begin. And, I know that if you're looking at climate change, you have to know what it's changing from and what it has been before to know what is normal, what is, human impacts and yes, the impacts of colonisation as well. So when it comes to talking to people who are in this kind of more westernised model of meteorology, how much do you find that their philosophy, and you're from a philosophy background, is kind of concreted in this kind of Western philosophy of science, and how much is it malleable? Is it changing, do you think?
I think there is a general interest from scientists working in specific fields. Meteorology is a good example, that are interested in learning more but don't know how to, haven't had the opportunity through the education system to really think outside of a framework that is very, very much structured around Western ways of knowing. So we talk, some decolonial theorists, and I really like this term, talk about a lot, epistemic violence, or epistemic marginalization, or dispossession is when you only really want to look at one epistemology, one philosophy of knowing, and that's the dominant way of knowing, and it reinforces the power structures that help to enable the colonial system to continue. And so Indigenous ways of knowing, and that's why Indigenous knowledge is such a important term to keep as a kind of blanket term for Indigenous sciences and things like that, is because it isn't disciplinary in the same way that Western ways of knowing can be, where ecology and biology and meteorology and archaeology, and they're all kind of different disciplines with some intersection and more happening now. Indigenous way of knowing is looking at a really holistic overview of how the environment and the people and the social systems and law and ceremony and spirituality and the mind and the heart all interact to guide a different observational system, where it's much more, it's still an observational system, but it is very much a intricate, complex understanding of a multitude of interactions that's developed over a really incredible millennia upon millennia, generations upon generations history of responding and adapting and observing and changing, and being not looking at the environment as objective or removed from you, but as you being part of it, influencing it back. This kind of respect and reciprocity with the environment. And so, yeah, I do think.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Go for
No,
it.
you go.
I was just going to say, when I think about it from the perspective of, my undergrad was in science and arts, and very much it's like, which one are you doing? Why are you doing both? They don't really go together, and it's not really this holistic view of disciplines, let alone the environment and humans. But the way that I guess I started to hear about colonisation and the environment when I was looking at things like sociology of the environment was very much this kind of colonial view of the environment and nature as something to conquer and to take over and to draw money from, I guess. And that kind of also was something that we would look at in terms of colonization and patriarchy, because it was definitely, you know, a very Western masculine adventurer man who was coming to kind of tame the environment, and she is Mother Nature, and, you know, we will have what we want from her, which is like really, you know, gross and seedy when you think about them talking about nature as a woman too. Is this kind of also why you think now it's so hard that, you know, in a country, or I mean many countries, many nations that make up what is now called Australia, there's been tens and thousands of years of this view of the environment and humans as being very much one and the same and connected, and then science and storytelling being, you know, one and the same when it comes to knowledge systems and things like that. And then now we have suddenly, recently, I guess, in the big scheme of things, this like ingrained culture we then have to kind of bring back. How do you actually go against that? Like, how do you even begin? That's a big question, I'm sorry.
No, it's a
something
good
I've been thinking about.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it first starts with asking yourself questions, particularly about the history of Australia. It's still one of those things. I think I often, if you're just starting out where you're maybe a younger person, or you've just not really had the opportunity to really engage with different ways of perceiving Australia, I think the Statement of the Heart is actually a really good place to start. So that was the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which came out a few years ago, which really guides the kind of, it's a really great way to start really thinking and thinking about a different, you know, political system outside of our current one, that, and social, you know, and a real push for restoring the environment around, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander history, which is the history of Australia. You know, Australia is, like you say, hundreds and hundreds of countries, hundreds and hundreds of nations, language groups, peoples, and wasn't 6 states, looked much more like a, you know, lots of little countries all over the continent. And those were bound by kinship laws and stories and dreaming stories and songlines, and that helped to guide the kind of governance of different communities within a region, and sometimes across the entire continent. And so, I think restoring that history is really important, really, really, really acknowledging the very, very violent history of Australia, which is still completely kind of swept under the rug, is really, really important, really restoring and talking about the truth, which is that colonization requires the marginalization and dispossession of people who were there before. When we look at it now, we call it invasion, and I think that's a really apt term for it, because you wouldn't go into another country now, take it over, and then just say, I mean, countries still do, but I mean, you know, there's a lack of kind of consideration for what exactly that process is, and it's very much built on extraction and wealth generation. If you have an empire like England or France or Portugal, or lots of, you know, there was lots of culprits, but in Australia, England, that is looking to expand its wealth, then land and resources that are within that land, agriculture, mining, wood, and people too, which is why slavery is such an important issue to also consider within Australia, is that, you know, that is built on the kind of antithesis to the people. It is built on coming in and completely decimating a current system and changing a current environment to better suit an extractive behaviour so that wealth can be accumulated within the kind of new metropole and sent back to the empire and the colony. And so, yeah, it is a different attitude towards land. And I think that still is a really big problem in colonized countries. I think there is a general attitude that it's still kind of not ours. Like if something's not yours, or you haven't had a longer connection to it, then your attitude about caring for something is different. And you can see that at home with stuff that you buy, or your car, for example. If you just, if it isn't yours, then you have a different type of attitude towards its care. And I think that's part of that difference, is that Indigenous peoples in Australia, but also everywhere, have a different attitude towards the environment because we're born there. That is our place, and we come from that.
And I think of, we talk about decolonisation, obviously acknowledging and learning about enough to acknowledge what has happened in the face of colonisation here and elsewhere is the first step, because if we can't acknowledge that, if we can't actually articulate what has happened, learn about it, and not just learn about it but unlearn a lot, then we can't hope to not make the same mistakes and try to start to undo some of the mistakes so they can't be made again. That seems like a first step, but then beyond that, when I think about things like decolonisation, I think about decolonising myself. So I personally, and I mean, we're talking personally, but if you're on the chat, please do let us know what country you're joining us from. If you don't know the First Nations people, the traditional custodians, find out, let us know where you are, and let us know something about where you are and what your connection is with the water, with the sky, with the sea, whatever it might be, because we all have those connections. But my kind of growing up as a farm kid, that was very much on land that's stolen. It's on land that was no doubt stolen, and, people were no doubt killed. Whilst the records may not be there, that doesn't mean that didn't happen. In fact, it's kind of impossible that it could have happened without that happening, whether people were killed through massacres or through disease, disease spreading, or through being pushed off land. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to decolonise myself as a farm kid, as someone who's been brought up to say, you identify with the land, you identify with this piece of land, but it's very much in the terms of owning it for profit, and it's very much in terms of this is ours and no one else's, and it's very much, whilst I think I've had a lot of farmers on Climate Australia already, and talking about farmers as environmental stewards, but I think there's a lot more that could happen in terms of talking about farmers as decolonisers, given that farming is colonisation really in Australia. I mean, I don't expect you to have all the answers for us as one person who's here today, but yeah, I guess I've been thinking more about what that means for me, because I don't even still personally own that land, but if and when I do, how will I make sure that I give it back, and how will I make sure that that happens in a way that is fair, because land rights are so designed for against people, I was talking to Justine Dillon, who is a woman actually from Yugambeh land, and she was talking about land rights and how they're those laws are kind of made for cousins to fight cousins, and for no one to be happy and no one to get justice as part of that. So yeah, I guess that becomes a bigger problem. How do you kind of start to tackle that when it comes to community engagement with white people? Is it even your job? Is it just like, that's not your job as a Connemara man?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think touched on a few things. Land rights is one of them. I'll start with land rights because it is correct to say that it is a colonial system. So native title is the acknowledgement of the Western court systems in Australia that law existed prior to colonisation. So it's very much based on the validation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander laws from a Western legal system. So within that, there are problems with it. One is that it's designed to give more clarity to the system rather than necessarily to the community. So if you are looking at mining, for example, in northern Queensland or central Queensland, then a mining company that has more clarity around where exactly the boundaries, the accepted boundaries of an Aboriginal community are, even though they might not be historic boundaries, it's just the only ones that they could validate against a Western system. Then you have more clarity around what you can go in and just to take from the land, even if it doesn't necessarily. And oftentimes when native title is determined, it's kind of cut around things like that, areas of significant economic interest, and it is all about kind of manoeuvring so that there's more clarity around what the actual colonial system can do. It's kind of, in my opinion, what it's for. There's people write about that, have written about that heaps of times. And it's very much based in this kind of Western idea of what land is, kind of a boarded property, which isn't necessarily true historically either. There's very much and even though we talk about nations, there's not, and there are boundaries. Sometimes, they can be blurred boundaries too, where they're co-owned or they're co-managed, or they're places of where two community groups can get together. Things like that, it's which we have in things, but it's very different too. We talk about boundaries now because of the fact that it's kind of easily related through, this kind of Western idea and framework. So
yeah,
I think that's a really interesting point about land rights. First and foremost, in that it kind of reflects a Western system and a Western way of understanding land. A second good place to start generally is just kind of asking yourself, well, what is decolonisation really? And really, in simple terms, it's listening and centering voices of Indigenous people. It is making sure that Indigenous people are central in the decision-making, in research, in policy, in planning, in governance, within a country that knows that their history is built on injustice and violence, displacement and marginalisation. It's recentering the traditional custodians and the original inhabitants of Australia into in a new system. So that's why I was pointing to the Statement of the Heart before, because I think that's a really good example of calling for the Makarrata Commission and another new kind of centering of voices in governance and policy, and so that there's nothing, so that we don't get policy that still entrenches marginalisation or dispossesses Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from land, or stops them from practicing custodianship over a particular area because it would be better off as a mine for economic purposes or whatever,
Yeah.
And so, I think it is very much about first asking what it is, and then recognizing that there is a reason for custodianship. It is because we come from the country. It's because it directly impacts back on us, and that we need to take care of it so that it can take care of us, and it's a reciprocal relationship. So if you think that, so in the context of a farm, if colonization is kind of the antithesis of that idea, it's the view that you can take land, change it, and change the environment. As far as I'm concerned, that's climate change too.
Yeah.
If you can change an environment to be a monoculture of wheat, I think that is climate change in a lot of ways. It's environmental change, of course, but it all links back up with the system. So, I think it's important. We haven't got into it yet, but climate change as are colonizing as the next kind of run on colonial outcomes. If you think about the contribution that colonization has made to current climate change through expanding in Australia, across the Americas, Africa, the Pacific, elsewhere, as particularly very, very resource extractive, and contributing to that real rise in greenhouse gas emissions over the 19th and 20th century, then climate change as it is today is a colonial process. It is just the next one. And so if it is a continuation of that, and it is exacerbating the risk for Indigenous peoples, socially, environmentally, financially, we've got to change our way of thinking about it and our relationship with the environment, using kind of climate change as that nexus where we can really start thinking about Indigenous voices in the country, and not as a tool, not as another discipline, but as an actual change in mindset.
Yeah, and I suppose this is a nice segue to talking about what your work is and is going to be moving forward in your PhD. So you've started a PhD this year, which is quite honestly, what a year to start.
I know.
I think when we spoke earlier in the year, you said you'd been in the office for only a few weeks before it was basically locked down from then on. And for those of you who are watching not in Australia, you may not realise, but Djarra is in Melbourne, where everyone's been locked down for the vast majority of the year. So I don't want to bring up, sometimes around friends with PhDs, it's like, just don't bring it up. This is the time not to think about it. But what is your kind of thinking going into your PhD? What sort of things are you wanting to focus on and find out during your PhD?
Yeah, so thanks. It is good. It's worth noting that it is not a great year to start a big project, but what can you do about it? It is thankfully Melbourne's coming out and getting back to kind of normal now. So it's a great feeling, and it gives you a lot of momentum for 2021. So that's always there's always a silver lining, I suppose. But yeah, I think I was really, really interested in climate change adaptation, particularly the thing, not so much mitigation, because I think mitigation is very much about the current system and trying to kind of reorientate it to be less emissions intensive. Adaptation, I think, is really interesting because we're responding to impacts of climate change. But in doing so, we're also responding kind of to impacts of the colonial system, as I kind of said before. So if we're responding to impacts of the kind of colonial system, then it's actually a really important opportunity to talk about decolonizing climate change adaptation, and in doing so, kind of trying to decolonize a system that has only ever worked against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And to do it, obviously I'm still working through everything, but I think there is a real place for decolonial research, decolonial thinking, and by decolonial research, I mean methodologies that preference Indigenous voices, center Indigenous voices, and take a look at the research within the context of a holistic way of knowing, or a holism that also includes yourself as a researcher, the communities that might want to come in and collaborate with you in your research, or the environment as well is really important. So, all those have a give and take relationship. So there's a reciprocity within it where there's some actual outcomes from the research process, not just for the researcher, but more importantly for the community that is involved. So I think that's really, really important. There's a respect shown between different knowledge systems, and there's an understanding that different ways of knowing are equally important in the process. So for me, I was thinking, well, this is really interesting. Climate change adaptation is practical responses to climate change. There's a history of different there's not necessarily a judgment call being made, but it is, there are issues with, preferencing external expertise in some instances, and particularly historic over the last 20 years. preferencing, bringing in kind of planners and outside scientists to kind of come in and help, which is great. But in doing so, we need to also really have the community there as the central guide. They're guiding you through a kind of process, and I think that's starting to change. There's more kind of critical thought being put into, well, what exactly will adaptation do? Will it just reinforce the system that has led us all here, or will it be an opportunity to kind of introduce new politics, introduce new ways of thinking, introduce new challenging thoughts, and really start to develop decolonial outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? So, or not just Indigenous people generally, actually, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but I also think, there's a real necessity to look at, the Americas and because we've got, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander have friends in a lot of ways all over the world that have gone through not exactly the same, but similar types of colonial processes. And I think there's a real opportunity to kind of learn from each other.
Yeah, and I think on that note, Sarah on the chat in Simpatico says, Sarah here, I'm from the States and I'm on Monacan land. So, it's interesting. Like, obviously all Indigenous peoples are different, but there is this sameness in the unfortunate circumstance of being colonised and being taken over, invaded, and on the positive side, the similarities come from that relationship between people and earth that isn't really reflected in the colonial culture, in white cultures for sure. So I think when we talk about things like decolonisation, I think people think maybe about Indigenous people being able to profit off the land, but it kind of goes beyond just existing in this kind of capitalist system that obviously is not going to end tomorrow, but talking about who is profiting, why, who is being centred when we're talking about these issues, and why are we only talking about them in terms of capitalism? Why does our government only implement something when it has kind of a money value on it that doesn't necessarily benefit any First Nations people? There's a lot of talk at the moment, given that it's 2020, about how we're entering this critical decade of action. Are you concerned that in this critical decade of action, if we don't do more to actually talk about this, that we could just end up recreating a colonial system that leaves First Nations people behind?
I do. That is a large concern of mine. But it's important to note that there is, I don't know, this is going to sound, I don't want to say this too strongly because I do think it can be a scary thought. But I mean, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been in Australia for at least 60,000 years. We're not going anywhere. What is changing is the environment, and it's kind of rejecting a colonial and capitalist system. Climate change is the country itself, the environment rejecting a system that is bad for it. And there will be a reckoning on the current system, and it will require change. How fast we get to that change is unknowable at the moment. I mean, if all things were great, we would get to it straight away and would start really talking and thinking about our attitudes and our relationships to the environment and what that means and what that's causing and what needs to change, and whether or not profit is the be-all and end-all of everything, or whether the value is not something that is monetary at all. And I think there is a real place for us to start thinking about those things and start thinking about, particularly now, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has provided a kind of opportunity to reset and think about, just ourselves, just people, how their relationship with the environment, the relationship with each other, having a bit more of a community spirit when it comes to tackling problems,
our relationship
working
with money.
together. And our relationship with money, of course, and our relationship with labour, and the work that we do and the compensation that we get for it, there's a lot of opportunity to think about changing a system that kind of got us here with climate change, and really tackling some of the broader questions over the next decade, and some of the really deep and hard questions like decolonizing systems that are so entrenched within a very specific mindset of kind of an objectivity of the environment that can be just owned and exploited and profited off, even if sustainability is kind of core of that, because we still see that sustainability doesn't necessarily equal any benefit for everybody. It can very much be an individualized process where, yes, you're managing a place sustainably, but it doesn't benefit the community. It really only benefits yourself. And so I think there is a rethink around what land actually means to the people, to the community. And I mean, this is getting kind of a bit esoteric, but I do think climate change is that next big question, that big problem that will be the catalyst for all these ideas and things to emerge, particularly as it starts to bite, which it already is. So, and that's kind of why, people like me and younger generations in Australia of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people are starting to really think about climate change in terms of justice, in terms of change, and in terms of kind of a revolutionary moment for not just the environment, for us too.
And I'm hearing it more and more. Even when you're at a climate protest and people are calling for climate action, you hear other people calling out in the crowd, not climate action, climate justice, until everyone starts chanting that instead. And I think that's quite symbolic of a conversation that's happening more broadly, that it's not just about action and not just about, sustainability along these metrics, but about what that means for people's daily lives, for people feeling, safe, feeling respected, feeling home, feeling connected to country, if there are First Nations people, feeling connected to each other regardless, feeling connected to country if they're not First Nations people. Because let's be honest, that's why we're here. Like you said, capitalism, and it is a system rejecting capitalism. I really like that analogy, because if it was our bodies rejecting an organ or rejecting some medicine or something we thought was medicine, we'd just say, well, that doesn't work. And we wouldn't try to come up with solutions that allow us to continue along that path. So that's exactly a huge challenge, but it's definitely, if we don't talk about it and if we pretend that capitalism isn't part of the problem, then how are we going to get there?
Yeah, it's very much is that type of just rethink, reset, rethink, ask questions, ask yourself what needs to change in your life and your system, in your country. There's opportunities to get out, there's opportunities to join groups, to join protests, to vote, to influence government, to try and influence policy through yourself as an individual, whether or not you can. And I do think it's that question, it's that process of asking questions and starting to really think that about the country that you live in and its relationship with its First Peoples, that will allow you to kind of try and get as close as you can to decolonizing your own life and the way that or getting kind of stuck in a system where you aren't sure what your impacts are on the environment or on people. And I do think the first step is just finding out more about where you live, whose people's lands are you living on, what their community name is, what the language they speak is. If you can, getting in contact, introducing yourself is always just like a really great first step.
Yeah, and I think, when I first spoke to you, it'd only been a few weeks since I moved here. And I was like, oh, it's actually awful how difficult it is to find out about the people. And you're like, well, that's a symptom of colonization. I'm like, well, of course it is, people being erased, displaced, that sort of knowledge not being passed on or allowed to be passed on is all part of it. Jason here, watching from Turrbal Yugara country, grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, definitely took for granted the Maori colonial relationship and still not perfect. Sarah again, who is joining us from Monacan land in the US, says, as I've been noodling on what decolonisation means today, I often find myself coming back to a pretty well-known quote from Audre Lorde. The true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. That's
a great quote, and that's that's a really great quote, and it's something that it's not necessarily, it's phrased in a different way, but there's also a process where you have to, as an Indigenous person, really decolonize your own mind away from being stuck in education systems are very westernized, and there is a kind of it still isn't really recognizing that there are different ways of knowing. There's different epistemologies, and so when you get stuck sometimes in what I call like a Western mind, you have to take a step back and think, well, hang on a minute, I am really narrowing down, and I am really kind of excluding a lot of other, you got to kind of open your mind up to look at the kind of the whole, rather than kind of sometimes what can feel like tunnel vision, where it's very much a discipline, particularly in education, particularly when you're talking about research, but also generally in life, where you really get stuck on no, this is the way things have to be done.
Yeah.
And it can be
totally.
whether or not that's economic, like, no, this is this is the way, like, this is the right, this is my discipline is all I kind of know about. I'm very focused on this one discipline and yes, I will work with other people who are very focused on theirs, and together we can create a whole. But it's also important to kind of expand your thinking out and trying to see in a more holistic way how everything kind of interacts with each other. It's hard, and I'm not saying or like anyone really, it's very, very hard, but it's also one of those things that I think is part of that process of decolonizing your own self.
Yeah,
and
it makes me think of
stuff.
I mean, internalization is a word that's often used in social inequity studies, internalized racism, internalized misogyny, internalized homophobia, where we all are brought up in this society that is all of these things, and therefore even if we don't think we are overtly, or even if we are someone who is part of a minoritized group, we will still be kind of soaked in the same internalized bias, and have to kind of learn to recognize and ring it out. I know, for instance, I don't know what it's like to internalize. I know what it's like to internalize racism as a white person, but I don't know what it's like to internalize racism as an Aboriginal person, for example. But I definitely think that part of that internalization of racism was being brought up to think I wasn't brought up to be racist. Because it kind of like, living in society here is being brought up in a racist world and having to kind of push against it, as opposed to being brought up without it, and going from there. I'm just posting a link in the Simpatico chat, but also posted in the other chats as well. When we're thinking about what we can do, Seed Mob I've just posting their website. There's a really exciting way that you can take action for climate when it comes to thinking about decolonisation. And you're involved in Seed Mob as well, or just
very
friends?
not.
I guess
kind of
like
friends.
there's an age limit to Seed Mob, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. But, just friends. I really think they do really great work, and if you can, donate, get involved. I mean, I've been involved in some different things, but yeah, I mean, the core Seed Mob team is amazing. So passionate and so hardworking to try and really change the extractive behaviour of Australia's kind of economy, particularly, but also other things. So that's really thinking about, you know, what the impacts are of mining or gas extraction on country. Why are we kind of pursuing risky extractive industry when there are viable alternatives now? And you know, I do think anyway. They're great. They're amazing people, an amazing organisation, so worth supporting and so worth not just with your money but time as well if you can, getting involved, going to marches, going volunteering if you can, if you've got time. So you know, just they're great. They really are amazing.
And there's ways you can support by, you know, adding your signature. But if you do have money to spare, and I know it is a tough time for money for lots of people, Seed Mob are also looking for donations. I'll just click on that here because they were or are still under the umbrella of Australian Youth Climate Coalition, but they are looking to become Indigenous-led and in their own right an organisation and raising the funds to make that possible, which I think is a great way of them being able to move forward and grow and be able to support all the things they do, which is great. So I just wanted to share that for everyone if you're watching and really, like Sarah said, noodling on decolonisation. None of these tiny steps are all of it, of course, but it might be a good place to start, having a look at what organisations like Seed Mob are doing and different ways you can support, whether that's time or money or even just reading, thinking, learning and incorporating things
sharing
into
online too.
Yeah, sharing online, sharing in your conversations. A lot of people will be having conversations over the holiday period with family, and I think it's definitely an important time to be thinking about those things too. So thank you so much. I've taken up so much of your time, Djarra. I'm so sorry, but I've just really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and it's definitely something that fits into a lot of other conversations that I'm having constantly with people about what climate action looks like, what climate solutions look like, and what climate justice looks like to bring about those things, because it should be what is at the forefront of those things rather than an afterthought. So thank you so much for letting us noodle on that with you. As Sarah said, I really appreciate your time.
No problem. And anytime, really. Thanks for having me.
Any last comments you want to leave everyone with before we close off the stream?
Just, you know, I think it's I think a lot of times it can seem like a really negative conversation, but, or can be, but I just really want to emphasize the positives in getting involved and learning more and, just growing as not only individuals, but as communities too.
Awesome. I agree. Thanks so much again, and we'll say goodbye. Awesome. That was Djarra Delaney there joining us on Climate Australia. That's it for me this week, and next week I'll be back with some more episodes. I'll be talking about Defensoras, which is all about Indigenous peoples of Latin America and women specifically, because we're talking about Defensoras, women who are defending the environment in that context. We'll also be talking to Hannah Feldman, who is a PhD student researching the youth climate strike, and in Australia, actually teenagers' views on that. She's been doing the hard work of surveying young people on their involvement or not with the strike and the different thinking they have around that. So we'll be talking to her as well. And that's really the end of my week here on Climate Australia. Stay well, everyone. If you were watching on Facebook and want to see more, you can watch this back again on CimpaticoTV. You can sign up, it's free, and they don't sell your data. So there you go. Thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye from me.